everybody. We have today we have with us Andrew Manson, our law enforcement SME and prior program manager for the FBI's domestic WMD response. Good morning, Andrew.
Good morning, Val.
And Kevin Quigley, an all-hazard SME at SummitET and a retired Marine Corps Siberni defense officer. Hi, Kevin.
Morning.
And Dr. Jeff Skinner, a radiation oncologist and Siberni subject matter expert at SummitET. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. So this morning we wanted to talk about an article that came out earlier in the year entitled "Ricin's Round 2: Germany Prevents Another Islamic State Motivated Bioterrorism Attack." So in 2018, Germany experienced its first ricin bomb threat, which had the capability to kill over 13,000 people. That plot, however, was disrupted thanks to U.S. intelligence, but it happened again in 2023, and German officials again faced another chemical attack. According to the media, the 2023 attack was postponed by the terrorists due to lack of the toxic ricin substance. So at the time, the officials were able to intercept before any loss of life, and that just recently happened this year. So we kind of wanted to take our SMEs today and talk through, bridge the gap between, what is this bioterrorist chemical and what does it mean to us as the public and as agencies? What is it that we could do? So, Kevin, give us a brief history on ricin as a WMD.
Yes, ma'am. Good morning. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. So ricin's been around for about 100.5 years, first discovered in 1888 by Peter Hermann Stillmark as a German scientist. And me and Jeff, we were just talking about this before it started. There's really no use that you're going to see this on the street to where it's just going to be naturally occurring out there. What's cool about ricin, what's different about it, is it's actually a toxin, a poison that's derived from a biological, from the castor bean, castor oil plant that you do see dual use in industry. But the actual ricin toxin itself is derived from castor. And Jeff, what were you saying when we were talking about the actual other uses that we could see ricin for in industry?
Well, so ricin in of itself is kind of a bad actor when it comes to eukaryotic cells or mammals, us. But that bad part of it, also could potentially be utilized and as a cancer therapeutic. If there was a way that you could target this only for cancer cells. And we'll talk a little bit about when I go through the biochemistry. But if you could get that A chain into a cancer cell and not into any normal cells, but the biochemistry of how ricin is such that it goes to all the cells. But if you could target into a cancer cells, it would be a great cancer killing machine if it could be specific to a cancer cell. So that is some area that there is some active research in. But obviously the risk of it not being accurately targeted, which is some of the problems with some of these antibody conjugated drugs, is what makes it a challenge.
Thanks. Yeah, so I think for responders and for the public, it's not going to be naturally occurring out there. There's a process that you go through to derive the ricin out of the castor bean, castor plant. And most of the time it's used for terrorism. We've seen it, past 20, 30 years on the military side. You see it on the first responder side from hazmat technicians for various causes, various ideations of terrorism, criminals, state-sponsored programs that are out there. So it's definitely a threat. It's definitely real. It's super deadly, super toxic. And Jeff's going to talk about it here in a second. But to see it out there, it's actually a white powder when it's done, when the finished product is produced. So right after the Marathrax attacks, like in the early 2000s, there was tons of white powder calls, just, hey, suspicious white powder. And most of the time it's baby powder talc, something that's out there that's a hoax. But you have to take each one seriously and go through the detection, identification, sampling process. And Andrew's going to talk about that from the law enforcement aspect. It's just it's definitely a thing. But what I liked about this story, it was a good news story. Intelligence was passed to the German responders. They were able to stop it in time. They actually didn't have a product finished. They were just ideations of it. They were going to do it, but it was stopped in time. And this stuff happens all the time, but most of the time the public really doesn't hear about it a lot. So it's good to have a good news story out there to where it was stopped in time. I'm going to stop talking for a minute. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Skinner. Do you want to go through the biochemistry a little bit on how this poison actually works, sir?
Yeah. So essentially it's two proteins that are linked together. There's an A chain, which is the action chain, and then a B chain, which is kind of the binding chain, and they're linked together with a bond. And it's known as a type 2 ribosome inactivating protein, RIP, rest in peace. So there are some, some scientists that come up with good acronyms. And what it does is it depurinates ribosomes. And so what? What does that mean? It means we can't make proteins. So it's a poison that impacts the structure, function, and regulation of cells that it interacts with. And so that's bad. It causes cell death by a number of different ways. And it's an incredibly lethal mechanism of killing cells and causing damage in cells. Now, getting back to ricin versus castor beans. Castor beans are around. The castor, the plant, Ricinus communis, is a very pretty plant that's in lots of different places. So castor beans are out there. So you do see ingestions of people that that will eat castor beans. Some of the castor beans are used in some jewelry, in fact. But it's hard to get poisoned by the castor bean alone without isolating the ricin poison, which is the issue for it. And we'll get a little bit more into how you get it, but you can eat it. You can inhale it, and that has to be kind of the purified poison for you to inhale it, which has to go through some processes. And then you can have it injected, and I'm sure we'll hear a little bit about that.
And Jeff, is there an antidote for ricin? Do you know?
There's not an antidote. So when we talk about why is this such a problem, so that's part of the issue, that there's access to castor beans. It's possible to isolate the ricin. There's no antidote. If you get a lethal dose, that you will be dead in 3 days. And part of why it's a problem is the detection and the ability to isolate that, whether you've been exposed or not, do anything. It's uncertain. So that's why it creates such havoc. Is you've got this 12 to 24 hour period of time of not knowing whether you've been exposed, and that's where the real damage comes in this. There's a level of uncertainty, and there's some testing that we can do that we'll talk about, but it's not perfect. So you've got an exposure to an unknown, maybe inhalated, maybe ingested, with kind of some vague symptoms, depending on whether it's ingested or inhaled, that creates the problem for this.
Interesting. Thank you so much. And Andrew, I want to kind of move over to you on the law enforcement side. How hard is it to get the material?
Well, I think that's the problem facing first responders and law enforcement. It's pretty easy. Ricin is one of the easier toxins to produce. As Jeff and Kevin said, castor plants are around. They're pretty common. You can order them. People use them. They're very pretty plants, and they do use the seeds to make jewelry and things like that. But the actual process to make ricin out of the castor beans is not very difficult. When terrorist organizations, have attempted to make other toxins like anthrax, it's a little more difficult technically to get anthrax in a way that it could be used as a weapon. But ricin, pretty much what you probably have in your kitchen, you could probably make it if you had just a little bit of know-how. And historically, it's been used much more as an assassination or a poison than a sort of a terrorist attack on a large number of people. The most famous attack was in '78 in London, where a Bulgarian dissident was waiting for his bus at a bus stop, and he felt like a pain in his leg, and he turned around and someone had dropped an umbrella, apologized, and left. And later that night, he developed a fever and some irritation at the site, and they didn't really know. He went to the hospital, and 4 days later, he was dead. And only after he had died and they were doing the autopsy did they find a tiny pellet that had been injected with that umbrella, presumably. And the pellet was hollow, and they believed that the ricin was in the pellet, and then it was the holes in the pellet were covered with something that would melt once it was injected into the body. And there was another Bulgarian dissident just around the same time who had also had a similar event, but they believed that the dosage in that pellet was not the lethal dose, so he survived. But when they went back to him and looked at the site, they found that the pellet, and so they believe those were from the Bulgarian Security Service and the KGB.
Okay. Wow. Interesting. And Kevin, maybe you can speak on this a little bit. What are the immediate and long-term social implications of, a ricin bomb?
Yeah, so with any type of like seaborne event that's going to be out there, it causes mass panic. There used to be we had a saying for like RDDs, for radiological dispersal devices, is a weapon of mass distraction. With this one though, it is deadly. Like if you had enough ricin stockpiled, produced, and you were able to disseminate it and spread it out there to the public or to a target, it's highly, highly toxic. So this article is a good news story. It was stopped in time. But I think in these types of events, it's important for agencies, governments, responders to train for these type of scenarios. And I know military side does, civil support teams, Marine and Army, Seaborne Defense, they do routinely train for chemical and then biological toxins like this, and then the rad and the nuke side. But I think at the law enforcement, the firefighter, the hazmat technicians that are out there, the emergency managers, the state, local agencies, they have to keep this on their radar. Not saying that there's like intelligence pushing this out there, but in the vast array of all the things that responders have to train for, I think biologicals and chemical toxins like this definitely needs to be trained for. And not to go deep into it, but there is personal protective equipment considerations for this, as far as respirators, suits, gloves, definitely iPro. There's detection aspects of this, like how do we actually detect it? And again, this one's a little weird because it's a toxin or a poison that's derived from a living biological. A lot of chemicals are a little bit easier, organic, inorganic, and then doing the detection piece on that. With this one, it's still okay because it's still a poison that we can detect, and to run that in the field and get that analysis piece. And then there's a decontamination piece of this as well. So anybody that goes into that hot zone that's doing that identification, sampling, monitoring, they need to get deconned on the way out. But I'm not going to go real deep into that, but that's some of the things that responders need to be looking at for this, and then the intelligence piece of this, and then, keeping the panic or keeping the public informed to mitigate panic. Does that kind of answer it? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of exercises and trainings go into that. Is there anything else that law enforcement's doing right now to prevent this kind of plot?
Well, I think that with these kinds of plots, what you're looking for, hopefully, is tips from the public. Tripwires is what the FBI calls them, where companies that sell castor beans or things like that, if they see a suspicious purchase, like maybe a single person ordering multiple times, all but to the same address, something that would seem out of the ordinary. Ricin domestically in the United States has mainly been used to poison ex-wives, ex-spouses, people that are dating their exes, things like that on a much more personal nature. One case, some coworkers of an individual found on the printer some sheets about how to kill people and get away with it. What's the perfect poison? They reported it. The police came and they found a gram of ricin, as well as like test tubes and some other stuff in his cubicle. So the FBI and law enforcement in general is really going to be looking to establish tripwires with companies that sell this, but also hoping that neighbors, friends, associates will just, if they see something, will say something.
Just to kind of, from the medical, response of this, which this is a large part, it's an initial medical response in 12 hours. And the medical part of it really is dealing with the uncertainty. And you have a covert and then you have an overt kind of nature here. And, the credibility of the event, is important to know this. What you're really trying to say is, what's your suspicion if you see white powder? What's your suspicion that this really is a real problem? Now, some of the issues that were alluded to is some of the infield testing that can be done. It's not as good as the confirmatory testing, and so we would want that infield testing to be a little bit, you have more false positives, which means that it says that you might have a risk, but in the end it may not be. And so you have a situation where you may have a poisoning with something that, if you get enough, is lethal, and you basically have a 12-hour period of time by the time you take a sample that's good enough, send it off to a confirmatory lab to confirm it, where you don't know. And so the category that you'd have to put this is people that maybe were definitely exposed, likely exposed, maybe exposed, or definitely not exposed. And for those that have some potential for exposure, you're going to have to monitor them. And some of the symptoms that you may have in the initial part of time could be related to the psychological component. So the education and the understanding and having a plan in place and understanding that the psychological component for them and their family really is critical for this, because there's nothing we really can do. And so understanding, that, because there's no test, and what are you going to look at, depending on whether it's inhaled or ingested. You're going to look at nasal congestion. You're going to look at, some trouble breathing, shortness of breath that progresses. These symptoms may occur 3-4 hours, and they're going to progress over time. And, and some of them are vague enough, nausea, vomiting. If you had a potential lethal exposure, you may have some nausea and vomiting. And so it's going to be hard to kind of tease these out. So having thought about this and understanding it is going to be very important, and being able to coordinate and communicate well with law enforcement, with their confirmatory labs, is critical.
Yeah, that's great. And we're really lucky at SummitET to have such informed and educated subject matter experts. What kind of exercises and trainings does SummitET offer right now to clients for this kind of biological WMD?
I was just going to kind of bring that up off Jeff, to dovetail off Jeff there. So now that we've kind of talked about like what it is, how to detect it, how to ID it, how to monitor it, what the medical implications are. If you're a law enforcement agency, what you're looking for tripwire wise with Andrew. I think doing it through the exercise and training piece of this with this type of scenario could show a response agency or a local government or state government their level of preparedness for this type of event. So going in, like, I have experience on this, or I've had these before, or maybe I haven't done it before. Let's figure out where we are, put a plan in place, whether that's like a standard operating procedure or a drill in place for whoever's going to be responding to this, and then validate it through exercises and training, and then refine it as threats emerge and evolve. Andrew, do you have more on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say that it's if you set up the right kind of plan to deal with the CBRNE environment, this would just be a piece of that. But really, a chance to have someone like Summit look at your plans, identify any gaps, help you develop the plan, and then exercise it, like Kevin was saying, where you bring in a tabletop usually would be first, where you bring in all the participants. You want people from hazmat and fire and law enforcement and the medical community, because I'm sure Jeff can say, if you're at a hospital and the first time you hear that there might be a exposure to something is when they're coming in the ambulance. That's the last thing you want. You want your plan to incorporate everyone that will be participating in an actual event, so you can identify those gaps and vulnerabilities and make your plan, robust enough to overcome those. Jeff, did you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think there's just some key parts to to understand. I think is the action at the site makes a difference in terms of limiting some of the concerns that you're going to have in terms of understanding what type of decontamination you need, what type of equipment that you need, what type of protective equipment that you need, and then understanding kind of the knowledge is power on this. If you don't develop symptoms within 3 or 4 hours and you make it to 12 hours, you're good for the most part. There's confirmatory and tests that we can do, but this is kind of a limited event in which knowledge can make a tremendous difference, and the confidence and taking care of people the right way, in that uncertainty range that we have. So knowledge is power on this, preparing for it, and having these hip pocket understanding that can make a big difference and provide confidence in this. A lot of this we have to do overkill on this, because there's no safe level of ricin. That's not something that is is a potentiality, but it's hard to get poison. It's accessible and you can get it, but it's not easy. But there's safe ways to combat it, and understanding those areas where you do have the uncertainty is going to give you the confidence to do the right thing, take care of people.
Great. Thank you so much for your insight, Jeff, and Andrew, Kevin, and thank you guys for being here with me today and helping to bridge the gap.
Thanks, Val.
Thanks.
Thanks.